I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank Richard Hodges and the museum people for sharing their space, and thank the School of Arts and Sciences for funding our events. I remember very clearly an upsetting moment when I first heard spoken the name Žižek. It was 1989. I just arrived at Penn and embarked on the dreaded Ivy League tenure track, which meant I was expected to be well along in writing a fabulous cutting-edge book. All I'd actually managed to do at that stage was to admit to myself that my dissertation was a piece of crap and that I had at best a few fragments toward a publishable manuscript. At a reception after a talk at the Comparative Literature Lounge, I was approached by a rather intimidatingly brilliant colleague, several years senior to me, a Russian with a PhD in mathematics, as well as this alarmingly fluent expertise in Hegel. He was a bona fide high theorist. He comes over and begins asking me the very questions I dreaded. What was my book about? How far along was it? What exactly were my arguments? So I answered evasively. I said I was writing about modernist fiction, about comedy, about politics. I nattered on for a minute, and he looked at me. He said, "It's interesting, but what are your theoretical coordinates?" And this was hitting too near the jugular for me. I knew that the theoretical tools I had picked up in grad school were the old standards and not by any means the latest high-octane stuff. All I could say was, well, there's Freud and there's Marx. There's Freud's jokes in the relation to the unconscious, and there's Marxist literary criticism as proposed in Jameson's The Political Unconscious. So I said, I'm basically trying to talk about literary jokes and their relation to the political unconscious. So this is the best I could do. My colleague scrutinized me again for another minute, and again he said, "Is interesting," but he added, "maybe a little derivative of Žižek." And so there it was, this word or name. I didn't even know at that time which it was. Was it a man, a woman, a collective or institution? This unfamiliar bisyllabic thrown down by a senior colleague as a criticism of my theoretical coordinates and a challenge to the value and originality of my work. So it was that I first encountered Žižek as insult. How to deal with such a wound? I left the reception. I walked the 2 blocks down to the house of our own bookstore where we got our books in those days. And right up front, I found the answer to my main question, what is this Žižek? There were several copies of a book called The Sublime Object of Ideology. Its author, Slavoj Žižek, positively identified as a male philosopher at the Institute for Sociology in Ljubljana. Further information gleaned from the cover was that this was his first book in English. There were already some in French. And that it had only just been published a month or 2 earlier. So feeling a little better now that I knew this Žižek was a quite recent phenomenon, at least on our side of the Atlantic, I bought the book, took it home, and began reading. But that only made everything worse again. For the intimidating colleague had been absolutely right about my belatedness and unoriginality. There was nothing I had written or tried to write or imagined writing about the relationship between humor and politics not already expressed with far greater force and complexity and clarity here in this damnable book. Here were Freud's Jewish jokes, Hegel's dialectical jokes, Lewis Carroll's vegetable jokes, all manner of popular Russian and Yugoslavian jokes about Stalinism, all brilliantly cracked open by an analysis that that pushed Marxism into an altogether new and difficult conversation with psychoanalysis. Here, beautifully complete, was the inchoate project I had wanted to claim as my own, that of unpacking the political logic of the joke and, conversely, locating the joke work at the core of ideology. Well, at some point during that first reading of that great book, these initial responses of professional angst and petty jealousy did give way to the rising sense one has of excitement when discovering a really important new writer and embarking on an intellectual itinerary that forces a rearrangement of one's earlier ideas. And in this case, there was also, to a rare degree in my reading in critical theory, and if I may say so, especially in Lacanian theory, there was also a great yield of pleasure, a joy in experiencing the voice or style of Žižek, which manages to install an explosive wit at the heart of a rhetoric of left political commitment. Here was a continental philosopher who could make you laugh out loud, who produced one surprising, giddy turn or tilt after another, who was always up to something and was never boring. In truth, the sublime object of ideology was a godsend for me at that point. Even just from this first, in English, of his many books, I learned an enormous amount. And one of the first and most immediately useful things I learned from it was that critique may be negated through affirmation, through the trick of denial by repetition, which is to say that, after reading the book, I had a way of fending off any further challenge from colleagues who asked me too many difficult questions about my manuscript on politics and humor. I would describe the project in a general way, and then I would say, of course, my theoretical coordinates are derived from Žižek. It worked like a charm. All right, that was 1989, a long time ago. Since that moment, Slavoj Žižek has published something like 50 books and pamphlets, including such classics of postmodern theory as Tarrying with the Negative, The Fragile Absolute, Enjoy Your Symptom, most recently, Living in the End Times. He and his work have been the subject of more than a dozen monographs, a couple of films, several hundred articles in the fields of critical sociology, cultural studies, and of course, film theory. Currently professor at the European Graduate School and director of the Institute for Humanities at Birkbeck College, London, he has been a professor or scholar in residence at, so it seems, half the universities in Europe and North America. He has crossed over, as we say, into the domain of the public intellectual, climbing high on those media lists of the world's most influential and celebrated thinkers, but using that elevation in admirably mischievous and irreverent ways. Žižek's prodigious publications and lectures can found easy summary. Though a systematic thinker, he hasn't handed us a grand system, he hasn't founded a school or put out a call for disciples and acolytes. Yet, if you have read around in his work, you know that the adjective Žižekian points to something as consistently present and as distinctive in his writings as what is Kafkan in Kafka's. And I don't mean only the matter of style. I'm talking also about a steadfast intellectual disposition through a period, postmodernism if you like, or late capitalism, a period when many critics have been giving up on critique, despairing of ever getting around the wiles of capital, the monstrous ironies of our times, the cynicism so comprehensive that even the tools of critical theory are somehow rendered cynical in our own hands. We know that they don't work on society, but maybe they'll still work to advance our careers. Through this period of critique's presumptive exhaustion, Žižek has been its indefatigable reinventor, articulating fresh insights again and again through Marx and Freud and Lacan, and producing therefrom stratagems for a repoliticization of our commoditized world. Reading Žižek, one feels less hopeless, less ready to accept the inevitability or imperishability of the contemporary order of things. This afternoon, Professor Žižek will address our topic of virtuality by posing the question, are catastrophes virtual? Please join me in welcoming to Penn Humanities Forum our very distinguished guest, Slavoj Žižek.
No, I can stay here. It's okay. No, but it's okay. I will stay here. Thanks very much for all of you coming here, all the distinguished guests, and especially for this kind introduction, which is too kind. I feel threatened by it. You know why? Because if you were still in that envious awe, that would have been a good sign. My idea is that the moment you are ready to praise a colleague, no matter how excessively you praise him or her, it means you already feel safe and above him, you know. So it means, yeah, when I was young, basically your message was, yeah, when I was young, I was stupid enough to be duped by me, but now I'm up there. No, I mean, no. And so, okay, thanks for claiming that I'm never boring and so on, so we can rely on that. Today I will try to surprise you and be boring. Seriously, I want to do some simple but a little bit more systematic line. Let me begin by Jorge Semprún, survivor of concentration camps in World War II and Spanish writer. He reports in his memoirs how he witnessed the arrival of a truckload of Polish Jews at Buchenwald concentration camp. They were stacked into the freight train, almost 200 to a car, traveling for days without food and water in the coldest winter of the World War II. Had death, except for 15 children, kept warm by the others in the center of the bundle of bodies. When the children were emptied from the car, the Nazi guards let their dogs loose on them. Soon, only 2 fleeing children were left. And then a quote from Jorge Semprún. The little one of the 2 children began to fall behind. The SS guards were howling behind them, and then the dogs began to howl too. The smell of blood was driving them mad. And then the bigger of the 2 children slowed his pace to take the hand of the smaller. Together they covered a few more yards, till the blows of the clubs felt them, and together they dropped, their faces to the ground, their hands clasped for all eternity. End of quote. What should not escape our attention is that the freeze of eternity is embodied in the hand as a partial object. While the bodies of the 2 boys perish, the clasped hands persists for all eternity, like the smile of the Cheshire Cat from Lewis Carroll. One can easily imagine how this scene should be filmed, while, at least I would have filmed it in that way, while the soundtrack renders what goes on in reality. The 2 children are clapped to death, torn apart by the dogs, and so on. The image of their hands clasped, of their freezes, immobilized for eternity, while the sound renders temporary reality, the brutal murder of the 2 boys, the image renders the eternal real. It is the pure surface of such fixed images, not any deeper meaning, which allows for redemptive moments in the bleak story of the Holocaust. The frozen image which insists over reality, rendered by sounds, reality, stands for a positive ethical utopia of eternity. So that's my first point. This image is real and at the same time virtual. And here I'm an unashamed Platonist. I think that Plato just has to be corrected the way Lacan suggests. A Platonic idea is not some deeper substantial reality. It's just, when an unexpected, miraculous ethical act occurs. Like here, the older boy gathering the courage at the moment practically of dying, of stepping back, holding the other guy's hand. This frozen image, this is eternity. This is the real. In a way, more real than the vulgar reality. It is real as virtual. What does this mean?